June 15, 1964, Seattle, Washington. Housing Department, King County Municipal Building. Inspector Hideo Tanaka opened the manila folder and felt his chest tighten. The address stared back at him like an accusation. 1247 Fairview Avenue North, Apartment 3B. 22 years he had avoided that street, crossed to the other side when business took him near it, changed his routes through the city. But the address had found him. An elderly woman named Cordelia Ashworth had filed for a housing assessment prior to sale, and now Hideo had to go there, inspect the apartment, file the paperwork, walk into the building where 22 years ago his family had been reported to federal authorities. The building where they had dragged his 5-year-old self from sleep, stuffed him into a potato sack in a neighbor's truck just an hour before the FBI arrived. The building where his mother, father, and younger sister had been taken away in government cars, never to return to these rooms. Hideo closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. His hands, accustomed to holding pens and rubber stamps, clenched into fists. Through his office window, he could see June sunshine flooding the Seattle streets. Children played stickball in an alley. Women carried shopping bags from the Pike Place Market. Life continued. But for Hideo, time had stopped in February 1942. And now, holding this folder with the name Cordelia Ashworth typed across the top, he understood that the past doesn't die. It just waits for its moment. Hideo left the municipal building at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In his hands, the folder with forms. In his jacket pocket, his inspector's badge. To any observer, just another government employee, 27 years old, average height, wearing glasses with neatly combed black hair. No one could have guessed that beneath his pressed white shirt beat a heart that remembered the smell of burning documents, shouts in English demanding compliance, and his mother's face for the final time. The walk to Fairview Avenue took 20 minutes. Hideo moved slowly, delaying the moment. Seattle had rebuilt itself after the war. New buildings rose where vacant lots had stood. The streets hummed with prosperity. But some buildings remained from before the war. Number 1247 was one of them. 3 stories, brick facade, with paint peeling around the window frames and sagging front steps. Hideo stopped across the street and stared at the windows of apartment 3B. Second floor, 2 windows facing the street. In the right window hung lace curtains. In the left window, a pot of red geraniums sat on the sill. Everything the same. 22 years, and those geraniums still bloomed red as blood. He climbed the front steps. The wood creaked under his feet. He remembered that creak. Remembered how his father would carefully climb these stairs each evening, returning from the cannery, trying not to make noise, not to draw attention. After Executive Order 9066, Japanese families were supposed to report for relocation. But his family had tried to hide. Kind people had given them false documents, arranged housing in this building. The landlady, Cordelia Ashworth, a widow, had agreed to shelter them for money. Father had given her their savings. They lived quietly, barely leaving the apartment. Mother cooked on a hot plate in the back room so the smells wouldn't reach the hallway. His sister, Emiko, only 3 years old, had learned not to cry. And Hideo, whom they called Hide-kun then, sat in the corner with wooden toy soldiers and learned to be invisible. Hideo raised his hand and knocked on the door of apartment 3B. Inside, he heard shuffling footsteps. Then the groan of floorboards. A voice, elderly but firm, asked from behind the door, "Who is it?" "Housing Department. Inspection for your property assessment application," Hideo answered. His voice came out level, controlled. Years of government work had taught him to manage his tone. The door opened. Before him stood a woman of about 74, thin and wiry, with a sharp chin and pale blue eyes that had faded almost to gray. Cordelia Ashworth. She had barely changed. The same thin lips, the same hands with prominent veins, the same expression, assessing, suspicious. She looked at Hideo for 1 second, 2, 3. He saw something flicker in her eyes, Recognition? Alarm? But she quickly composed herself. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Hideo crossed the threshold. The smell of the apartment hit him like a slap. The smell of old wallpaper, mothballs, boiled cabbage, and something else. Something that existed only here. The smell of his childhood. The smell of the last day he had been simply a child, not an orphan. The hallway was narrow and dim. Hideo automatically turned his head to the right. There was the door to the small room where he and Emiko had slept. The door was closed. "Do you need to inspect all the rooms?" Cordelia Ashworth asked. Her voice was dry, businesslike. "Yes, standard procedure," Hideo replied, taking a form from his folder. He looked at the paper but saw something else. Saw how in February 1942, 2 men in FBI windbreakers had entered this apartment. Saw how his mother had clutched Emiko to her chest. Saw how his father had stood with his back straight, looking into the eyes of the men who had come for them. And saw her, Cordelia Ashworth, standing in the corner of the hallway with an expression that held no pity, no fear. Only the cold satisfaction of someone who had completed an unpleasant but necessary task. Cordelia Ashworth led him into the large room. This was where his parents had lived. Now the room was furnished with heavy furniture, a wardrobe, sofa, table covered with a crocheted tablecloth. Photographs in frames hung on the wall. Hideo moved closer, pretending to examine the condition of the windows. In one photograph, a young Cordelia stood next to a man in an army uniform, her husband, killed in 1936. In another photograph, she stood older, wearing a hat, in front of this building. "How long have you lived here?" Hideo asked, looking out the window. The question was routine, part of the inspection, but his fingers gripped the pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Since 1937, she answered. "Got the apartment after my husband died. He was a sergeant, died honorably in service." Pride rang in her voice. She was accustomed to telling this story, accustomed to the respect that followed mention of her hero husband. "So you lived through the war here," Hideo said, turning to look her in the eyes. "Yes, right here. Those were difficult times, very difficult." She shook her head, and there was no hint of insincerity in her voice. She believed her own words, believed she had endured difficult times, that she had survived, that she had earned this apartment, this life. Hideo made a note on his form. His hand moved mechanically. "Please show me the other rooms," he requested. The small room where the children once slept was now a storage closet. Boxes of canned goods, sacks of flour, old blankets folded in stacks. Hideo stood in the doorway and stared at the corner by the window. That's where his mattress had been. That's where he had lain the night before the raid, while his mother sang him a quiet lullaby in Japanese, a song her mother had sung, and her mother's mother. A lullaby about a little rabbit going to the mountain. He still remembered the melody but never sang it aloud. Cordelia Ashworth explained. Hideo nodded. He imagined how she had kept reserves in 42, how she had hoarded butter, rice, bacon, how she had received ration books and extra provisions for cooperation. For each reported family, the authorities paid informants. Some betrayed out of fear, some for money. Cordelia Ashworth was the second kind. She had taken money from his father for shelter, then sold them to the FBI for additional payment. Double profit. Practicality. __quote _13__. She indicated the last door. __quote _14__. The kitchen was tiny. A stove, table, 2 chairs. On the wall hung a calendar with a picture of Mount Rainier. June 15th, Wednesday. An ordinary day. Hideo approached the window. It looked into the courtyard. From this window, 22 years ago, his mother had watched as a government truck took away the neighboring family. She had seen it and known they would be next. But she couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe that the woman they paid, who ate at the same table with them, who had held little Emiko in her arms, was capable of this. Hideo returned to the large room. Cordelia Ashworth stood by the table, watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, filling out the form. His handwriting was steady, professional. "I'll submit the assessment within 3 business days." "Thank you," she said, then added, "Would you like some tea? You look tired." The offer startled him. For a moment, he almost refused. But something stopped him. Curiosity? A need to prolong this encounter? To understand who this woman was? "Yes," he heard himself say. "Thank you." She put the kettle on. While the water boiled, she brought out cups, a sugar bowl, a plate with store-bought cookies. They sat at the table. The same table where his family had eaten their last meals together. "You're very young for an inspector," she remarked, pouring hot water over tea bags. "Started in the department right after college," Hideo replied. He sipped the tea. It was too hot, burned his tongue. "Were you in the service?" "No. 4F. Vision problems." This was true. His nearsightedness had kept him out of the draft. He hadn't served in Korea, hadn't worn a uniform, had simply continued his life in Seattle, quiet and unremarkable. "My nephew served in Korea," Cordelia said. "Came back changed. War does that to people." Hideo said nothing. He thought about how war had changed him without him ever holding a rifle. How war had taken his family, his childhood, his name. His birth name had been Hideo Tanaka. After the war, he had lived with foster parents named Kiyoshi. When he turned 18, he had legally combined the names, Hideo Kiyoshi Tanaka, a hybrid identity for a hybrid existence. "Tell me," Cordelia said suddenly, "do you remember the war? You would have been very young." Her eyes fixed on his face with strange intensity. "I remember some things," Hideo said carefully. "I was 5 when Pearl Harbor happened." "Frightening times," she murmured. "Everyone was afraid. You couldn't trust anyone." "No," Hideo agreed. "You couldn't." They finished their tea in silence. When Hideo stood to leave, Cordelia walked him to the door. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Ashworth," he said formally. "Will you need to come back?" "Not unless there are problems with the paperwork," she nodded. As he stepped into the hallway, she called after him. "Inspector." He turned. "Yes?" "You remind me of someone. I can't quite place it." Hideo met her gaze. "I have one of those faces," he said. He left the building and walked 3 blocks before stopping to lean against a brick wall. His hands were shaking. He had thought he could do this professionally, dispassionately. Inspect the apartment, file the forms, forget. But sitting at that table, drinking tea in that room, had torn open something he had sealed shut 22 years ago. He couldn't forget. Not now. Not ever. 3 days later, Hideo submitted the housing assessment. The apartment was structurally sound, suitable for sale. He signed his name at the bottom. H.K. Tanaka, Housing Inspector, King County. His supervisor approved the report without comment. The file was closed. But Hideo couldn't close it in his mind. That night, he lay awake in his small apartment on Capitol Hill, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his mother's face. He could barely remember it now. 22 years had blurred the details. But he remembered her voice. Remembered how she sang to him and Emiko. Remembered how she had smiled when father came home from work. Remembered how that smile had vanished after the executive order, replaced by constant worry. He thought about his father. Kiyoshi Tanaka had worked at a salmon cannery on the waterfront, came home smelling of fish and brine. A quiet man who rarely raised his voice, but proud. Proud of being American, of providing for his family, of teaching his children English and Japanese both. Quote, 42. Quote, he used to say. Quote, 43. Quote. The bridge had collapsed in February 1942, and Hideo thought about Emiko, 3 years old. She had loved her cloth doll, carried it everywhere. The doll had a faded floral pattern and button eyes. When the FBI came, Emiko had clutched that doll to her chest. They had taken it from her hands when they processed the family at the assembly center. Quote, 44, quote, the guard had said. Emiko had screamed. That was the last sound Hideo remembered from his sister, screaming for her doll. The next Wednesday, Hideo did something that surprised him. Instead of going straight home after work, he walked to Fairview Avenue. He stood across the street from number 1247, watching the windows of apartment 3B. At precisely 2 o'clock, he saw movement behind the lace curtains. Cordelia Ashworth appeared at the window, watering the geraniums. She didn't look out, didn't see him. But Hideo stood there for 15 minutes, watching. He didn't know why, didn't understand what drew him back. But something pulled him to this place, this building, these windows. The next Wednesday, he came again, same time, 2 o'clock. He watched from across the street. Cordelia appeared at the window again, following what was apparently her routine. This time, she did look out, scanning the street. Hideo stepped behind a parked truck so she wouldn't see him. He felt ridiculous. A 27-year-old man hiding from an old woman. But he couldn't stop. On the third Wednesday, he crossed the street, climbed the stairs, knocked on the door of apartment 3B. Cordelia opened the door and showed no surprise at seeing him. Quote, 45, quote, she said. Quote, 46, quote. Quote, 47, quote, Hideo said. Quote, 48, quote. She studied his face for a long moment, then stepped aside. Quote, 49, quote. They sat at the same table. She didn't offer tea this time, just sat with her hands folded, waiting. I need to know something, Hideo began. His heart pounded, but his voice stayed level. During the war, did you have tenants in this apartment? Cordelia's expression didn't change. Yes, several families over the years. Why do you ask? Do you remember any Japanese families? The silence stretched between them. Outside, a car honked. Somewhere above, footsteps crossed a floor. But in apartment 3B, the silence was absolute. Yes, Cordelia finally said. I remember. Tell me about them. Why? Because I need to know. Cordelia rose and walked to the window. She stood there with her back to him, looking out at the street. There was a family, she said quietly, a couple with 2 small children. They came in January 1942 after the executive order. Wanted to hide instead of reporting for relocation. I agreed to help them. For payment. What were their names? Tanaka. Kiyoshi and Tsuruko Tanaka. A boy named Hideo and a girl named Emiko. She turned to face him. You're the boy. It wasn't a question. Hideo nodded slowly. Cordelia sat back down. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them on the table. Hideo said. His voice was steady, but his nails dug into his palms. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 67, underscore, underscore. And she did. She told him how his family had arrived on a cold January night, how they had carried only small suitcases, how his father had counted out bills, $300, everything they had saved. How Cordelia had taken the money and promised safety. Quote 68, quote, she said. Quote 69, quote. Quote 70, quote. Quote 71, quote. She paused. Quote 72, quote. Hideo's stomach turned. You sold us for $200. No, I sold you for $500. The $300 your father paid, plus the $200 reward. I told myself I had no choice, that they would find you anyway, that I was just a practical woman doing what she had to do to survive. Did you believe that? I wanted to. But no, I knew what I was doing. I knew where they would send your family. I knew people were dying in those camps. Not officially, of course, but everyone knew. Hideo stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor. He walked to the window. the same window his mother had looked through. They didn't die in the camps, he said. Not all of them, anyway. Cordelia looked up sharply. What? My father died at Minidoka. Heart attack 6 months after arrival. Stress, poor conditions, broken spirit. My mother survived the camp. She was released in 1945. But she never recovered. Died in 1947 of pneumonia. Or grief. Probably both. And your sister? Emiko died at Minidoka. Measles. No proper medical care. She was 4 years old. Hideo turned to face Cordelia. You didn't just report us. You killed them. I didn't. Yes, you did. The words hung in the air between them. Cordelia's face had gone pale. Hideo's voice broke slightly. He cleared his throat. Mr. Chen put me in a potato sack in the back of his truck. I remember the smell of dirt and potatoes. I remember crying silently because my mother had told me to be quiet. I remember the truck driving away, and through a small hole in the sack, I saw the lights of our building getting smaller. Where did he take you? To a family in Olympia, the Kiyoshis. They took me in, raised me as their own. They were good people. When the war ended, they helped me search for my family. That's when we learned my father and sister were dead. My mother was in a sanatorium, dying. I saw her once before she died. She didn't recognize me. The war had broken her mind as well as her body. Cordelia had started crying silently. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks, but she made no sound. I'm sorry, she whispered. Hideo shook his head. Your apology means nothing. I didn't come here for an apology. Then why did you come? I don't know, Hideo admitted. I saw your address on that form and something inside me broke open. I thought I had made peace with the past. But I hadn't. I had just buried it. And now it's back, and I don't know what to do with it. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Cordelia spoke. What do you want from me? The truth, all of it. Everything that happened, everything you remember, everything you felt and thought and did. Why? Because I need to understand. I need to know who you are. What kind of person does this? I've spent 22 years imagining a monster. But you're not a monster. You're just a woman. An ordinary woman who made an evil choice. And I need to understand how that happens. Cordelia nodded slowly. I'll tell you everything. But not today. It's too much for one conversation. When? Come back next Wednesday, same time, 2 o'clock. I'll tell you the whole story, everything. It may take many visits. Hideo considered, then nodded. Next Wednesday, 2 o'clock. And so it began. Every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, Hideo Kiyoshi Tanaka climbed the stairs to apartment 3B and sat at the table with Cordelia Ashworth. And she told him the story. Not all at once. Week by week, piece by piece, she reconstructed what had happened 22 years ago. The first Wednesday, she told him about her childhood. Born in 1890 in Tacoma, daughter of a railroad worker. Married at 20 to a man who became a soldier. Widowed at 46 when her husband died in a training accident. Quote, 104, quote, she said. Quote, 105, quote. The second Wednesday, she told him about the years before the war, how she had struggled to keep the apartment, how she had taken in boarders to make ends meet, how she had learned to be hard, to trust no one, to take care of herself because no one else would. Quote, 106, she said simply. Quote, 107. The third Wednesday, she told him about December 1941. Quote, 108. The fourth Wednesday, she told him about the executive order. Quote, 109. The fifth Wednesday, she told him about the day his family arrived. Quote, 110. The sixth Wednesday, she described the month his family lived with her. Quote, 111. The 7th Wednesday, she told him about the fear. Quote, 112. The 8th Wednesday, she told him about the decision. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 113, underscore, underscore. The 9th Wednesday, she told him about the day they came. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 114, underscore, underscore. The 10th Wednesday, she told him what his mother had said. Quote, 115. Quote, the 11th Wednesday, she told him about the guilt. Quote, 116. Quote, the 12th Wednesday, she told him about the money. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 117, underscore, underscore. The 13th Wednesday, she told him about the nightmares. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 118, underscore, underscore. The 14th Wednesday, she told him about the end of the war. The 15th Wednesday, she told him about the decades that followed. The 16th Wednesday, she told him about the times she almost confessed. The 17th Wednesday, she told him about the photographs. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 122, underscore, underscore. The 18th Wednesday, she showed him the photographs. Hideo held them with shaking hands. His mother, young and frightened, staring at the camera. His father, dignified even in defeat. Emiko, tiny and confused. And himself, 5 years old, with those same dark eyes that now looked out from the bathroom mirror every morning. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 123, underscore, underscore. Hideo said. It wasn't a request. Yes, Cordelia agreed. The 19th Wednesday, she told him about her isolation. I have no friends, no family left. My nephew visits twice a year out of obligation. I deserve this loneliness. It's my punishment. The 20th Wednesday, she asked him a question. Why do you keep coming, week after week, listening to me? Why? Hideo thought for a long time before answering. I'm trying to understand evil. Not movie evil. Not monsters with fangs. Ordinary evil. The evil of an ordinary person who makes a terrible choice. If I can understand it, maybe I can make sense of what happened. Maybe I can find some kind of peace. Have you found it? No, not yet. The 21st Wednesday, Hideo told her about his nightmares. I dream about that night in the potato sack. I dream that Mr. Chen changes his mind, takes me back, and I have to watch what happens to my family. In the dream, I can't move, can't speak. I just watch. I'm sorry, Cordelia said. I know, Hideo replied, but it doesn't help. The 22nd Wednesday, Hideo told her he had been searching for someone. My uncle, my mother's brother, Minoru Watanabe. He survived the war, moved to Chicago after his release from Topaz. I've been writing letters, making phone calls. I found him last month. Cordelia went still. You found him? Yes. He's 63 now, works as an accountant, lives in Chicago with his wife and 3 children. I wrote him about you, told him what you did. What did he say? He wants to meet you. Cordelia's face went white. 133rd Wednesday, Cordelia talked about her fear of the coming meeting. The 24th Wednesday, Cordelia was silent for most of their time together. Finally, she spoke. The 25th Wednesday, Hideo brought something with him, a small silver bracelet and a child's drawing. These were Emiko's, he said. Mr. Chen saved them. Gave them to me when I turned 18. The bracelet was a gift from our mother. The drawing is a flower Emiko made the day before we were taken. She gave it to me to keep safe. Cordelia looked at the items but didn't touch them. Quote, 148, quote. Quote, 149, quote, Hideo said. Quote, 150, quote. The 26th Wednesday, Uncle Minoru came. Hideo and he arrived together. Cordelia opened the door and saw them both. She went pale as paper. Underscore underscore quote underscore 151 underscore underscore Minoru said. His voice was calm, without hatred. She stepped back wordlessly, letting them enter. They sat at the table, the same table where the Tanaka family had eaten their last free meals. Minoru looked around the room, at the walls, the windows. Quote, 152, quote, he said. Quote, 153, quote. Cordelia nodded. Quote, 154, quote. Quote, 155, quote. Quote, 156, quote. Quote, 157, quote. Quote, 158, quote. Quote, 159, quote. Quote, 160, quote. Minoru's voice remained steady, but his hands on the table were clenched. Why did you do it? Cordelia told him the same story she had told Hideo. Week by week, over 26 Wednesdays, she had reconstructed her own evil. Now she gave it to Minoru in one sitting. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. My sister was a kind woman, he finally said. She would have pitied you, even for what you did. She had that kind of heart. I don't. I feel no pity. But I came here because I needed to see the person who destroyed my family. I needed to put a face to the evil. Now I have. Now I can go home. He stood. Hideo stood as well. Wait, Cordelia called as they moved toward the door. They turned. She stood in the middle of the room, hands clasped. I want you to know, I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't expect it. But I remember every day, every single day. And that's my punishment. Not prison, not execution. Memory. Memory that won't let go. Minoru looked at her for a long time. That's a weak punishment for such a crime, but it's the only one available. Live with it. They left. Cordelia stood alone in the empty apartment, sat down at the table, looked at the clock. Wednesday, 2 o'clock. The time Hideo usually arrived. But he wouldn't return today. She knew that. Hideo stopped coming on Wednesdays. 26 meetings had ended. The story had been told, recorded, witnessed. The meeting with Uncle Minoru was the final punctuation mark on this ritual. But life continued. Hideo moved to Chicago to be near Uncle Minoru. There, he met his extended family, cousins he hadn't known existed. Minoru told him stories about his mother, about her childhood, about who she had been before the war. He showed him old photographs that had miraculously survived. In one, his mother wore a white graduation dress. In another, she held baby Hideo in her arms. These photographs filled the emptiness that had gaped in his memory for 27 years. In Chicago, Hideo met a woman named Ruth. She worked as a librarian. Her family were Jews who had fled Germany in 1938. They understood loss without needing words. Hideo and Ruth married in April 1967. A year later, a daughter was born. Hideo named her Emiko. When he held her for the first time, so small and helpless, he wept. Wept from joy and pain together. Joy that life continued. Pain that his sister had never known this joy. Cordelia Ashworth lived 7 more years. She died in February 1972, at age 82, quietly in her sleep. Neighbors found her 2 days later. On the table in the large room lay a note written in shaky handwriting. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 167 underscore underscore, Hideo received the apartment. But he didn't live in it. He sold it. The money went to the Japanese American Citizens League to support redress efforts. He stayed in Chicago with Uncle Minoru. There he married, had a daughter, built a life. The notebooks he had kept during those 26 Wednesdays stayed in an old suitcase. He showed them to no one but reread them sometimes, to remember. In 1987, when the country began speaking openly about the internment camps, Hideo donated those notebooks to the National Archives. 26 records of conversations with Cordelia Ashworth. Testimony about how an ordinary woman became a betrayer, and how, 22 years later, she paid for it. Not with prison, not with execution, but with memory. The same memory that doesn't let go, that comes every Wednesday at 2 o'clock and sits at the table and forces you to remember. Again, and again, and again. In the archives, there is a photograph. In it, Hideo Tanaka, now an elderly man, holds a small silver bracelet and a child's drawing of a flower. Next to the photograph, a placard reads, quote, 168. Below that photograph is another. The building at 1247 Fairview Avenue North in Seattle. 3 stories, brick facade, peeling paint. On the windowsill of apartment 3B sits a pot of red geraniums. The placard beneath reads, __quote _169 __. In 1992, Hideo returned to Seattle with his daughter Emiko. She was 23, freshly graduated from college. He took her to 1247 Fairview Avenue North. They stood across the street, looking at the windows of apartment 3B. The geraniums still bloomed on the sill. The new residents had no idea what history connected to these walls. Hideo said. Young Emiko took her father's hand. They stood for a while longer, then left. Hideo never returned to Seattle again, but every Wednesday at exactly 2 o'clock, wherever he was, he would sit down, take out an old notebook, and write a few more lines. Recording thoughts, feelings, memories. Continuing his conversation with Cordelia Ashworth, though she had been dead for 20 years. Because this conversation wasn't about her or about him. It was about memory. About how memory lives longer than people. How it survives executioners and victims alike. How it remains when nothing else does. This story didn't end with forgiveness, not with punishment, not with justice, simply with memory. Memory that lives longer than people, that will outlive all of us, that will remain when there are no executioners, no victims. Only truth will remain. Harsh, merciless, but the only real truth. And every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, somewhere in the world, someone sits down at a table, opens an old notebook, and reads the story of the Tanaka family. And Cordelia Ashworth, and the 26 Wednesdays that bound them together forever. Memory doesn't die. It just waits for its moment.